To accomplish a semi-gloss finish that I want for our paint, I can use a glossy BSDF node. So let's go ahead and add that, shader glossy BSDF. And now to mix it, I'll simply duplicate this mix shader node with Shift D. And I have a couple options for plugging this in. I can just keep continuing linearly down the chain and plug it in here. But the problem with that is it keeps the paint color in our diffuse separated from our glossy BSDF, in the same way that the paint is separated from the anisotropic metallic element underneath. And I would prefer to keep the paint color and the paint finish as one overall element. So instead, I'm going to mix in the glossy before it mixes over top of our metallic element up here. And so I can kind of reorganize my node tree. And since I'm treating this diffuse with glossy mixture like it's a single paint entity, I can show you another node that's called the frame node. And so we can add that, Shift A, it's in the layout menu, frame. And what this allows us to do is to kind of visually group our nodes that relate to one another. So I can select them and kind of drag my mouse into the frame node, and you'll see that it encompasses all of our nodes. And so I can open the view panel and we can call this paint so that our tree is a little more visually organized. And alternatively, if we have the node wrangler tools enabled, let's get rid of that frame node. I can select the nodes that I want framed and simply hit Shift P, which in my opinion is a much easier way to do that. Call it paint once again. And like all our nodes, we can change the color to be whatever we want. And so now that we have distinguished our overall paint element, which is a combination of the diffuse and the glossy, let's go back down here to more appropriately mix in our reflection, because right now it's at 100% with a factor at 1. And so in this case, we want the glossy reflections to have much less influence in the mixture. So let's try 0.2. And perhaps that's still a little bit too strong because the color of our texture has been dulled down, which means that we're reflecting more of the environment. And so we can, let's try dialing down our roughness to, let's say, 0.05, so that the reflections are a little bit more clear. And when we do that, we can see that our mix value is too high at 0.2. So let's go to 0.1 and cut that in half. Now we're starting to get this type of semi-gloss paint finish. So I could call this finished. The reflections are good enough, I suppose, but the fact is reflections aren't so perfectly consistent across the surface in reality, which brings us to the idea of fresnel. And this is perhaps a little on the advanced side of material understanding, but in my opinion, it's so necessary for a realistic result that I want to include it here in the fundamentals course. So I'm going to add a fresnel node, Shift A, it's in the input section, fresnel. And we'll drop that to the left of our glossy BSDF inside the frame node, which you can see swallows it up. And let's hit Shift-Control-Click on this node by itself so we can see exactly what that output looks like on our material. It's a white and black range where along the edges the value is closer to white, but the majority is a darker value. And so since this object is a sphere, it's pretty easy to tell what the fresnel is doing. And we can see this gradient where the surface that faces more directly at us is darker. So all these dark places, the surface is facing at the camera, whereas the lighter surfaces are glancing angles. They're facing more perpendicular to the camera. And so the way this works with reflection is the lighter values will reflect with more intensity and the darker values will reflect with less intensity. So we can use this white and black range from the fresnel output and plug it into our mixture to control how much reflection is being added. So let's go ahead and do that. And also note that the fresnel node only has one setting, the index of refraction. You can Google fresnel index of refraction and find a list of various materials and their IOR value. In this case, 1.45 is like a standard plastic fresnel value. So this will work good for our semi-gloss paint finish. And so now if we look at this paint mixture, the change may not be that noticeable to you. However, the closer that you look, you should be able to see the gradient that happens from the very edge where our reflection is a little more bright, and then as the reflection reaches to the front of the surface, it diminishes. However, I like to use fresnel not only on the intensity of the reflection, but also on the roughness of the reflection. So currently the roughness is uniform all over the surface at a value of 0.05. Remember that number. If we shift control click on the Fresnel once again, what I want to see is the reflections become more clear as we approach these lighter values. And then as the reflections face the camera more directly, they become more blurry. And so if we think in terms of the roughness value, remember that the lower we go, the more crisp the reflections become. And the higher in value that we go, the more blurry they become. So we need to reverse this output of the Fresnel because I want these darker values to actually be blurrier, to be closer to white. And what we see now as the lighter values, I want to be darker so that they're more clear. And to do that, I'm going to use a color ramp node. So let's go grab it, Shift A, it's in the converter section, color ramp. And I'll slide it into this noodle right here, and then also into the frame node. And initially there's no difference. This node works kind of like a levels operation in Photoshop, where we can drag up our light and dark flags to crush the whites or blacks. And since I want to reverse the Fresnel output, let's simply switch the flags around with this button so that the surface that faces us most directly is now white. But remember, white is a value of 1, and a value of 1 for roughness basically makes it a diffuse type of reflection. So really we want that value to be 0.05 as we plugged in initially. So I can select my white flag and select the color and set all of these RGB flags to 0.05. That way the range goes from 0.05 to a value of black. Now black being 0 is I think a little too extreme. So I think we'll change that to 0.001 so that it's almost a chrome-like reflection, but it's just got the slightest bit of blurriness. And so now let's plug this output into the roughness of our glossy and take a look at the mixture now. Again, you may not be able to see the difference right off the bat, so let's try a before and after render. First I'll unplug the mix factor and our roughness and render with uniform reflections. Though first I should draw a render region around just our shader object. Shift B to box select that region, just for the sake of rendering a little faster. And now kick off that render. And now switch to our next slot. Escape to go back to the node editor and plug in our color ramp into the roughness, and then the factor for our Fresnel into the factor for the mix shader, and render that comparison. Okay, let's see the before, Alt-J, and then after, before, after. Seeing them back and forth reveals that the change is actually quite substantial between non-Fresnel here, with our reflections being completely uniform, to here where we have a variety of reflection quality according to Fresnel. And one place that it's very obvious to me is right here along this side where our reflection is brightest and most clear. And then as the reflection reaches around to the front of the surface, it not only diminishes in intensity, but it also blurs out. And so that kind of gradient is what I'm after. It's much more realistic than this. And so that is our semi-gloss finish to the paint. All we have left to do is incorporate a grime element and a scratches element.